When 72-year-old Samuel Martinez stepped into the cattle auction house that Tuesday morning, the snickers followed him like shadows. His weathered hands gripped a crumpled piece of paper containing calculations that would either save his failing ranch or destroy what little reputation he had left. The young ranchers in their pressed shirts and polished boots saw an old fool chasing impossible dreams. They had no idea they were about to witness the most extraordinary comeback in ranching history. What happened next would shock an entire community and prove that sometimes the greatest victories come to those who refuse to listen to the laughter of others. Samuel Martinez had been working the same patch of Colorado land for 47 years, watching seasons change like pages in a book he knew by heart. His ranch, the Double M, sprawled across 300 acres of rolling hills that had once been the envy of the county. Now, at 72, he moved slower than he used to, his joints creaking like old barn doors in the morning cold, but his mind remained as sharp as the day he first set foot on this property. The trouble started 3 years ago when the drought hit harder than anyone expected. Wells that had never run dry began gasping for water, and pastures that once grew thick with grass turned brown and brittle. While other ranchers had the money to dig deeper wells or truck in water, Samuel watched his savings disappear faster than morning dew. His wife Margaret had passed away 5 years earlier, leaving him not just heartbroken but also without her keen business sense that had helped keep the ranch profitable through previous hard times. His neighbors began treating him differently. Where once they sought his advice on cattle breeding and land management, now they spoke about him in hushed tones at the local diner. The Martinez spread was becoming an eyesore, they whispered, bringing down property values and making the whole area look shabby. Some even suggested he should sell to one of the big agricultural corporations that kept sending representatives to his door with offers that seemed generous until he realized they wanted to strip mine his land for natural gas. The younger generation of ranchers was particularly harsh in their judgment. At 30 and 40 years old, they ran operations with modern equipment, computer-controlled irrigation systems, and business degrees from state universities. They saw Samuel as a relic from a bygone era, too stubborn to adapt and too proud to admit defeat. When he showed up at community meetings or cattle auctions, their conversations would pause just long enough for him to feel the weight of their disapproval. Jake Morrison, whose father had once been Samuel's closest friend, was among the most vocal critics. At 35, Jake ran a 1,000-acre operation with all the latest technology and a line of credit that seemed unlimited. He had inherited not just land but also his father's fortune, built during the oil boom of the 80s. Jake made no secret of his belief that Samuel should step aside and let someone younger and more capable take over the land. The mockery reached its peak during a particularly brutal town hall meeting about water rights. Samuel had stood up to speak about traditional water conservation methods his grandfather had taught him, techniques that had sustained the land for generations. Before he could finish his first sentence, Jake interrupted with a laugh that echoed through the room. Samuel's own children had given up on the ranch years ago. His son David lived in Denver, working as an accountant, visiting only on major holidays with grandchildren who seemed more interested in their phones than in learning about ranch life. His daughter Maria had moved to California after college, pursuing a career in marketing that kept her too busy for more than occasional phone calls. They both loved their father, but they saw his determination to keep the ranch running as a futile gesture that was slowly eating away at any inheritance they might receive. The financial pressure was crushing. Samuel owed money to the feed store, the equipment dealer, and the veterinarian. His credit at the bank was exhausted, and the loan officer, a young woman who looked barely old enough to drive, spoke to him with the kind of patience usually reserved for confused elderly relatives. She had suggested he consider assisted living facilities, as if his struggle with the ranch was evidence of declining mental capacity rather than simply bad luck and challenging circumstances. But Samuel had a secret that none of them knew. During his sleepless nights, when worry about the future kept him staring at the ceiling, he had been reading. Not just farming journals and cattle breeding guides, but scientific papers about sustainable agriculture, climate adaptation, and innovative ranching techniques being developed at universities around the world. His old computer, a gift from his children 5 years ago that they assumed he barely used, had become his window into a world of knowledge that most of his critics never bothered to explore. He had been corresponding with researchers at Colorado State University, sharing observations about his land that he had made over nearly 5 decades. His detailed records of rainfall, temperature, soil conditions, and plant growth patterns going back to the 1970s were exactly what climate scientists needed to understand long-term environmental changes. What Samuel saw is just the normal record-keeping of a careful rancher. The researchers recognized as invaluable data that could help develop new approaches to sustainable agriculture. The professors were amazed by the depth of Samuel's understanding of his land. He could predict weather patterns weeks in advance based on subtle changes in plant behavior and animal movements. He knew which areas of his ranch would flood during heavy rains and which would stay dry during droughts, knowledge that came from decades of careful observation rather than computer models. Most importantly, he had ideas about how to work with natural systems rather than against them, concepts that aligned perfectly with cutting-edge research in regenerative agriculture. Samuel had also been quietly experimenting on small sections of his ranch, testing techniques that seemed crazy to conventional thinking but made perfect sense to him. He had been allowing certain areas to grow wild, letting native plants return and watching how they changed the soil. He had been moving his cattle in patterns that mimicked the natural movements of wild herds, allowing pastures to recover completely before being grazed again. The results were encouraging, but he needed more time and resources to prove that his methods could work on a larger scale. The morning of the cattle auction, Samuel made a decision that would change everything. He had scraped together enough money for one last gamble, a purchase that everyone would see as the desperate act of a foolish old man but that he believed could be the foundation for proving his theories. He had spotted an opportunity that all the younger, supposedly smarter ranchers had overlooked, something that required not just money but the kind of deep understanding of cattle and land that could only come from a lifetime of experience. As he drove his old pickup truck toward town that morning, Samuel thought about his grandfather, who had survived the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression through careful observation, hard work, and willingness to try new approaches when old methods failed. His grandfather had always said that the land would teach you everything you needed to know if you were patient enough to listen and humble enough to learn. Samuel had been listening for 47 years, and now he was finally ready to put everything he had learned to the test. The young ranchers at the auction house were about to discover that experience and wisdom could be more valuable than money and modern equipment. They were also about to learn that sometimes the biggest risks are taken not by the youngest and most aggressive, but by those who have lived long enough to understand that some opportunities only come once in a lifetime. Samuel parked his truck in the dusty lot outside the auction house, took a deep breath, and prepared to show them all what a real rancher could do. The auction house buzzed with the familiar sounds of ranchers conducting business. Men in crisp Western shirts and polished boots clustered around the sale catalog, discussing lot numbers and estimated prices with the confidence of those who had money to spend. Samuel entered quietly, his worn jeans and faded shirt marking him immediately as someone who belonged to an earlier era of ranching, when success was measured by the health of the land rather than the size of the bank account. Jake Morrison stood near the front, surrounded by his usual group of followers, younger ranchers who had inherited wealth and modern operations. They were studying the catalog with the intensity of day traders, calculating potential profits and discussing which lots would be worth their investment. When Samuel walked past them toward an empty seat in the middle section, their conversation paused just long enough for him to feel their judgment. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Pete Williams who had been running cattle sales in the county for over 20 years, recognized Samuel with a brief nod. Pete remembered when the Martinez Ranch had been one of the most successful operations in the area, when Samuel's cattle had consistently brought top dollar and his breeding program had produced bulls that other ranchers fought to purchase. Those days seemed like ancient history now, and Pete wondered what had brought the old rancher to an auction where the bidding would likely go far beyond his means. The first several lots were exactly what Samuel expected. Prime breeding cattle from well-known operations commanded prices that made him wince. Jake Morrison successfully bid on a group of young Angus heifers for $40,000, an amount that represented more than Samuel's entire annual income. The crowd murmured approval at Jake's purchase, recognizing it as the kind of smart investment that would strengthen his already impressive operation. Samuel waited patiently, his weathered hands holding the auction catalog that he had studied for hours the night before. He wasn't interested in the prime cattle that were attracting all the attention and driving up the prices. He was waiting for lot number 47, a group of animals that everyone else in the room was likely to dismiss as not worth their time or money. Lot 47 consisted of 32 mixed-breed cattle from a ranch that had gone bankrupt in the neighboring county. These weren't the carefully bred, registered animals that serious ranchers typically sought. They were a mix of breeds, ages, and conditions, the kind of cattle that meat packers usually bought for immediate processing. The auction catalog described them simply as mixed commercial cattle, various ages, sold as seen, which in auction language meant buyer beware. But Samuel had driven 3 hours to see these cattle in person the week before the auction. What he saw confirmed something he had suspected from the brief description and the low estimated price. These animals were descendants of hardy, drought-resistant bloodlines that had been developed during the difficult years of the early 20th century. They weren't pretty by modern standards, lacking the uniform appearance and impressive size of contemporary breeding stock, but they carried genetic traits that could be invaluable for ranching in an era of climate uncertainty. The cattle came from the old Henderson Ranch, where Samuel's grandfather had purchased bulls back in the 1950s. The Henderson family had maintained their own breeding program for over 70 years, focusing on animals that could thrive in harsh conditions rather than those that looked impressive in show rings. When drought and falling cattle prices finally forced them into bankruptcy, their unique genetic legacy was being scattered to whoever was willing to bid on unfashionable cattle that most modern ranchers would consider inferior. Samuel had also researched the genetic background of these animals more thoroughly than anyone else at the auction. During his late-night internet sessions, he had discovered research papers about heritage cattle breeds and their superior adaptation to environmental stress. Universities were spending millions of dollars trying to reintroduce genetic diversity into modern cattle herds that had become too narrowly focused on rapid growth and high milk production. The Henderson cattle possessed natural genetic diversity that researchers were trying to recreate through expensive breeding programs. More importantly, Samuel understood something about these cattle that the other bidders missed. Their mixed breeding and varied appearance weren't signs of inferior quality but evidence of careful selection for practical traits like disease resistance, efficient feed conversion, and ability to thrive on marginal pasture. These were exactly the characteristics that would become increasingly valuable as climate change made traditional ranching methods more difficult and expensive. When Lot 47 was announced, Samuel felt his heart rate increase. The auctioneer described the cattle in terms that made them sound like the least desirable animals of the day. He mentioned their mixed breeding, varied ages, and the fact that they would need to be picked up immediately from a ranch that was already closed. The estimated price range was so low that several ranchers laughed, treating it as comic relief between the serious bidding on valuable cattle. Jake Morrison turned around to look at Samuel when the bidding opened, a smirk on his face that suggested he was enjoying watching the old man prepare to embarrass himself. Jake had assumed Samuel was there to buy a few cheap cattle for his failing operation, the kind of desperate purchase that would confirm everyone's belief that he was no longer capable of running a serious ranch. The bidding started at $500 for the entire lot, roughly $16 per head, which was barely above meat packing prices. Samuel raised his hand immediately, and Pete Williams acknowledged his bid with surprise. A few other hands went up, but without enthusiasm. These cattle weren't the kind of investment that attracted serious money, and most ranchers were saving their resources for better opportunities later in the sale. Samuel found himself competing against two other bidders, neither of whom seemed particularly committed to winning. One was a small-scale rancher who probably needed cheap cattle to stock his pastures, and the other appeared to be bidding for a meat-packing company looking for animals they could process quickly. The bidding proceeded slowly, rising in small increments that reflected the low level of interest in the lot. At $800, the small rancher dropped out, leaving Samuel to compete against the meat packer representative. Samuel knew this was his moment, the culmination of months of research and planning. He also knew that everyone in the room was watching what they assumed would be a futile gesture by an old man who couldn't afford to fail but was about to anyway. The bidding continued, rising past $1,000, then $1,200, then $1,500. Samuel could feel sweat on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Each bid represented a significant portion of his carefully hoarded resources, money he had saved by cutting every possible expense and borrowing against his equipment. If he was wrong about these cattle, if his theories about their value were just the wishful thinking of a desperate man, this purchase would complete his financial ruin. At $1,800, the meat packer representative hesitated, checking his calculator and, obviously wondering if these cattle were worth more than processing value. Samuel seized the moment and bid $2,000, an amount that represented nearly every dollar he could scrape together. The meat packer shook his head and sat down, apparently deciding that the cattle weren't worth the risk. Pete Williams called for final bids, his voice echoing through the sudden quiet of the auction house. When no other hands appeared, he pointed at Samuel and announced, "Sold to bidder number 73 for $2,000. The crowd stirred with surprise and what sounded like suppressed laughter. Jake Morrison was grinning openly now, apparently delighted that Samuel had just spent his last money on cattle that everyone else considered worthless. As Samuel signed the purchase papers, his hands trembled slightly, not from age but from the magnitude of what he had just committed to do. He had bought 32 cattle for roughly $62 each, animals that carried genetic potential worth far more than their purchase price, but only if he was right about their value. He had also committed himself to proving that experience and wisdom could triumph over youth and money, that sustainable ranching methods could succeed where conventional approaches were failing. The real test was just beginning. Samuel had to transport these cattle to his ranch, integrate them into his experimental management system, and prove that his unconventional methods could transform what everyone saw as inferior animals into the foundation for a superior operation. He had purchased not just cattle but an opportunity to demonstrate that sometimes the most valuable things are those that others overlook, and that true success comes from understanding rather than simply spending money. Samuel spent the 3-hour drive back to his ranch with his mind racing between excitement and terror. Behind him, loaded in 2 borrowed trailers, were 32 cattle that represented either his salvation or his final mistake. The animals were tired from the loading process and the unfamiliar transportation, but Samuel had noticed something during the loading that confirmed his hopes. Despite their varied appearance and the stress of the auction, these cattle had remained calm and manageable, showing the kind of temperament that came from generations of careful selection. When he arrived at the Double M Ranch, Samuel faced his first major challenge. His existing pastures were in poor condition after years of overgrazing and drought, exactly the kind of land that conventional wisdom would consider unsuitable for introducing new cattle. But Samuel had been preparing for this moment, studying rotational grazing techniques and natural land restoration methods that most ranchers had never heard of. Instead of turning the new cattle loose on his best remaining pasture, as any sensible rancher would do, Samuel implemented a plan that seemed to make no sense at all. He divided his land into smaller sections using temporary fencing, creating a system that would allow him to move the cattle frequently and give each area time to recover completely before being grazed again. The concept was based on mimicking the natural migration patterns of wild herds, something he had read about in research papers but had never seen practiced on a working ranch. The first few weeks were the hardest of Samuel's life. His new cattle needed constant attention as they adjusted to their new home and his management system. He was up before dawn every day, checking on the animals, moving portable fencing, and monitoring the condition of his pastures with an intensity that bordered on obsession. His neighbors driving past his ranch shook their heads at what they saw, convinced that the old man had finally lost his mind. The cattle themselves seemed confused by Samuel's management approach at first. They were used to being left in large pastures for months at a time, free to graze wherever they pleased until the grass was eaten down to nothing. Samuel's system required them to be moved every few days to fresh sections of pasture, a disruption that initially stressed both the animals and their new owner. But Samuel had faith in principles he had learned from his grandfather and confirmed through his research. He believed that both the cattle and the land would adapt to this new approach if he was patient and consistent. Jake Morrison made a point of driving past the Martinez Ranch regularly during this period, often bringing friends to see what he described as a perfect example of why old ranchers should retire. The sight of Samuel's mixed-breed cattle being moved constantly from one small pasture section to another seemed to confirm every criticism of the old man's methods. The cattle looked unimpressive compared to Jake's uniform, well-fed Angus herd, and Samuel's intensive management approach seemed like the desperate efforts of someone who didn't understand modern ranching efficiency. But Samuel was seeing things that his critics missed. Within a month, he noticed that the cattle were adapting remarkably well to his management system. They had learned to anticipate the moves to fresh pasture and followed him eagerly when he came to relocate them. More importantly, the genetic diversity he had hoped for was revealing itself in ways that surprised even him. Some of the cattle thrived on sections of pasture where his previous animals had struggled, showing an ability to digest lower quality forage and maintain good body condition despite the challenging environment. Samuel also began documenting changes in his land that were too subtle for casual observation but significant to someone who had been studying the same acres for nearly 5 decades. Areas that had been grazed using his new rotation system were showing signs of recovery that seemed impossible given the harsh conditions. Grass was growing back thicker than it had in years, and plant species that had disappeared during the drought were beginning to return. The soil felt different under his feet, softer and more alive than the hard-packed earth that resulted from continuous grazing. The university researchers who had been corresponding with Samuel became increasingly interested in what he was doing. Dr. Elena Rodriguez from Colorado State University had been studying sustainable grazing systems for over a decade, but most of her research was conducted on experimental plots rather than working ranches. When Samuel began sending her detailed reports of his progress, along with photographs and soil samples, she realized that he was implementing techniques on a real scale that she had only been able to test in small research plots. Dr. Rodriguez arranged to visit the Martinez Ranch in late summer, bringing graduate students and sophisticated monitoring equipment to document what Samuel was accomplishing. The visit was supposed to last 1 day but extended to 3 as the research team became fascinated by the changes they observed. They found that Samuel's rotational grazing system was increasing soil organic matter, improving water retention, and supporting biodiversity in ways that matched their best-case theoretical models. More importantly, the researchers discovered that Samuel's mixed-breed cattle were demonstrating genetic traits that commercial breeding programs had been trying to develop for years. The animals showed superior drought tolerance, disease resistance, and feed efficiency compared to conventional cattle breeds. Their varied genetic background allowed them to thrive in conditions where more narrowly bred animals would struggle, exactly the kind of adaptability that would become increasingly valuable as climate conditions became less predictable. Samuel's detailed record-keeping impressed the researchers as much as his practical results. He had been documenting not just cattle performance and pasture conditions, but also weather patterns, soil changes, and wildlife populations with the thoroughness of a trained scientist. His observations provided exactly the kind of long-term data that researchers needed to understand how sustainable grazing systems could work in real-world conditions. The transformation wasn't limited to his cattle and land. Samuel himself was changing, gaining confidence and energy that had been missing for years. The daily challenges of implementing his new management system required physical effort that kept him active and engaged. More importantly, the positive results he was seeing validated years of study and planning, proving to himself that his ideas weren't just the desperate fantasies of a failing rancher but practical solutions that could work. By fall, Samuel's cattle were showing body condition scores that rivaled those of any herd in the county, despite being fed nothing but the grass from his recovering pastures. The calves born that spring were thriving in ways that surprised everyone who saw them. They were hardy, active, and growing well on their mother's milk and the improving pasture conditions. Most remarkable, Samuel hadn't spent a cent on supplemental feed or veterinary care beyond basic vaccinations, while other ranchers were struggling with feed costs and health problems related to stress and poor nutrition. The financial picture was also beginning to improve. Samuel's operational costs had dropped dramatically under his new system. He wasn't buying expensive feed, paying for costly veterinary treatments, or investing in heavy equipment that required constant maintenance. His most significant expenses were for temporary fencing materials and his own labor, both of which were paying dividends in improved land and cattle performance. Word of Samuel's success was beginning to spread beyond the immediate community, despite his neighbors' continued skepticism. Agricultural extension agents who had heard about his work from university contacts began making visits to see his operation firsthand. They found practices that challenged everything they had been taught about efficient ranching but results that were difficult to argue with. The transformation had only just begun, but Samuel knew he was on the right path. His gamble on the auction house cattle was proving successful beyond his wildest hopes. The animals he had purchased for $62 each were demonstrating value that couldn't be measured simply in market price. They were the foundation for a ranching system that was not only economically sustainable but actually improving the land while producing healthy, profitable cattle. Samuel's critics were about to discover that sometimes wisdom and experience could achieve results that youth and money couldn't buy. The following spring brought changes that no one in the county could have predicted. Samuel's ranch, which had been written off as a failing operation managed by a stubborn old man, was becoming the center of attention from agricultural researchers, sustainability experts, and progressive ranchers from across the region. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had published preliminary findings from her study of the Martinez Ranch in a prestigious agricultural journal, and the results were generating interest far beyond academic circles. The research paper documented remarkable improvements in soil health, water retention, and biodiversity on Samuel's land, achieved through what the researchers termed adaptive multi-species grazing management. The technical language couldn't hide the simple truth that Samuel's methods were working better than anyone had imagined possible. His mixed-breed cattle were not only thriving but actually improving the land they grazed, reversing decades of environmental degradation in just 18 months. Samuel's cattle were also proving their worth in ways that even he hadn't anticipated. The calves born in his first year under the new system were developing into exceptional young animals, showing the kind of vigor and hardiness that commercial breeders spent millions trying to achieve. They were growing faster on grass alone than neighboring cattle fed expensive supplements, and they were showing remarkable resistance to diseases and parasites that plagued other herds. The genetic diversity that Samuel had recognized in the auction house cattle was expressing itself in unexpected ways. Some animals excelled in the ranch's higher elevations, thriving on mountain grasses that other cattle found difficult to digest. Others performed best in the lower meadows, efficiently converting marginal forage into high-quality beef. The varied genetic background that had made the cattle look unimpressive at auction was proving to be exactly what was needed for a complex and challenging environment. Jake Morrison's attitude towards Samuel began to shift when his own operation faced serious challenges that spring. A disease outbreak in his prize Angus herd required expensive veterinary intervention and resulted in significant calf losses. At the same time, the cost of feed supplements continued to rise, and several of his pastures showed signs of degradation that would require costly reseeding. Jake found himself envying the stability and low operating costs of Samuel's system, even as he struggled to understand how such unconventional methods could produce such consistent results. The moment of true vindication came when the County Extension Office organized a field day to showcase innovative ranching practices. Samuel had been reluctant to participate, knowing that his methods would be scrutinized by ranchers who had been criticizing him for years. But Dr. Rodriguez convinced him that sharing his knowledge could help other ranchers facing similar challenges, and Samuel's deep sense of responsibility to the land ultimately overcame his natural humility. More than 60 ranchers attended the field day, including several from neighboring states who had heard about Samuel's work through agricultural networks. They arrived expecting to see interesting research but not necessarily practical applications for their own operations. What they discovered challenged everything they thought they knew about successful ranching. The tour began in Samuel's most degraded pasture, an area that had been severely overgrazed and damaged by erosion just 2 years earlier. The transformation was dramatic and undeniable. Where visitors expected to see bare soil and struggling grass, they found thick, diverse vegetation that looked more like natural prairie than typical ranch pasture. The soil was dark and rich, obviously full of organic matter that had been absent for decades. Wildlife that hadn't been seen on the ranch for years was clearly present, from songbirds to beneficial insects that indicated a healthy ecosystem. Samuel explained his rotational grazing system with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen his theories proven in practice. He showed how the cattle were moved frequently enough to prevent overgrazing while allowing adequate recovery time for the plants. He demonstrated how the animals' natural behavior could be harnessed to improve soil health through their grazing patterns, hoof action, and fertilization. Most importantly, he shared the economic benefits of a system that required minimal external inputs while producing superior results. The cattle themselves were the most convincing evidence of Samuel's success. The mixed-breed animals that had been dismissed as inferior at the auction house had developed into an impressive herd that showed none of the uniformity prized by conventional breeding programs but all of the practical qualities that made for profitable ranching. They were healthy, productive, and obviously well adapted to their environment in ways that impressed even the most skeptical visitors. Dr. Rodriguez presented data showing that Samuel's ranch was sequestering carbon at rates that exceeded those of natural grasslands, making it not just environmentally neutral but actually beneficial for climate change mitigation. The soil organic matter had increased by percentages that typically took decades to achieve, accomplished in less than 2 years through careful management of grazing patterns. Water infiltration rates had improved dramatically, reducing erosion and increasing the ranch's resilience to drought conditions. The economic data was equally impressive. Samuel's operating costs per head of cattle were less than half the county average, while his animals maintained body condition scores that matched or exceeded those of heavily supplemented herds. His veterinary costs were minimal, feed costs were zero, and his infrastructure investments consisted mainly of portable fencing that could be moved and reused indefinitely. Most importantly, his land was improving rather than degrading, meaning that his operation was becoming more valuable and productive over time. The questions from visiting ranchers revealed how radically Samuel's approach differed from conventional wisdom. They wanted to know how he could achieve such results without expensive equipment, commercial fertilizers, or supplemental feeding. They were amazed that his cattle could thrive on grass alone, especially grass grown on land that had been considered marginal just a few years earlier. Most of all, they were curious about how an approach that seemed to require more labor could actually be more profitable than automated systems. Samuel answered their questions with the patience of a natural teacher, explaining concepts that he had learned through decades of observation and months of research. He emphasized that his system required understanding rather than technology, careful observation rather than expensive monitoring equipment, and willingness to work with natural systems rather than against them. He acknowledged that his methods might not work everywhere but suggested that the principles could be adapted to different conditions and environments. Jake Morrison approached Samuel privately during the lunch break, his usual arrogance replaced by genuine curiosity and something that might have been respect. He admitted that his own operation was facing challenges that Samuel's methods might help address. He asked if Samuel would be willing to consult on transitioning part of his ranch to a more sustainable system, an offer that represented a complete reversal of their previous relationship. The field day concluded with requests from several universities to establish long-term research partnerships with Samuel's ranch. Agricultural Extension Services wanted to develop demonstration programs based on his methods. Most surprisingly, a major cattle genetics company expressed interest in studying his mixed-breed cattle to understand the traits that made them so well adapted to challenging conditions. Samuel found himself invited to speak at agricultural conferences and field days throughout the region. The man who had been dismissed as a relic from an outdated era was suddenly being recognized as a pioneer in sustainable agriculture. Universities that had ignored his initial inquiries were now competing to collaborate with him on research that could revolutionize ranching practices. The transformation of Samuel's reputation was as dramatic as the transformation of his ranch. Neighbors who had openly mocked his methods were now asking for advice on implementing similar practices. Young ranchers who had dismissed him as irrelevant were requesting internships to learn his management techniques. Most importantly, Samuel's success was inspiring other older ranchers to believe that experience and wisdom could be as valuable as youth and capital in meeting the challenges of modern agriculture. Samuel's vindication was complete, but he approached his newfound recognition with the same humility that had carried him through years of criticism and failure. He understood that his success was built on principles that were much larger than one man's achievement, and he was determined to share his knowledge in ways that could benefit the entire agricultural community. 2 years after the field day that changed everything, Samuel Martinez stood on the same hill where he had once contemplated selling his ranch to pay his debts. Now, at 75, he surveyed land that had been transformed beyond recognition, supporting not only his own successful operation but serving as a living laboratory for sustainable agriculture that was influencing ranching practices across the country. The Double M Ranch had become a destination for agricultural tourists, researchers, and progressive farmers from around the world. Samuel had reluctantly agreed to hosting monthly educational tours, recognizing that sharing his knowledge was both a responsibility and an opportunity to influence positive change in agriculture. The tours were consistently overbooked, with visitors ranging from beginning farmers to established ranchers seeking solutions to environmental and economic challenges. Samuel's cattle had evolved into something unprecedented in modern ranching. What began as a mixed group of auction house discards had become a carefully managed population that demonstrated the benefits of genetic diversity and natural selection. The animals showed remarkable adaptability to changing conditions, thriving during drought years when other herds struggled and maintaining excellent health without expensive medical interventions. Several major universities were conducting ongoing studies of the herd's genetics, hoping to understand and replicate the traits that made them so successful. The economic transformation of Samuel's operation was as dramatic as its environmental success. The ranch was now generating income from multiple sources beyond traditional cattle sales. Research partnerships with universities provided funding for ongoing studies while allowing Samuel to maintain control over his management practices. Educational programs brought in additional revenue while spreading knowledge that could benefit the broader agricultural community. Most importantly, his cattle commanded premium prices from buyers who recognized their superior genetics and grass-fed credentials. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had published multiple papers based on research conducted at the Martinez Ranch, establishing it as one of the most thoroughly documented examples of regenerative agriculture in North America. The data showed continued improvement in soil health, water retention, and carbon sequestration, providing scientific validation for practices that had once been dismissed as the eccentric theories of an old rancher. The research was being cited by policymakers developing agricultural programs and by other researchers studying sustainable land management. Jake Morrison had become one of Samuel's most dedicated students, transitioning significant portions of his own ranch to rotational grazing systems based on Samuel's methods. The transformation wasn't easy for someone accustomed to conventional approaches, but Jake was motivated by both environmental concerns and economic realities. His operating costs had decreased substantially while his land showed measurable improvement, vindicating his decision to swallow his pride and learn from someone he had once dismissed. Samuel's family relationships had also been transformed by his success. His son David had taken leave from his accounting job to spend a year learning his father's methods, recognizing that the ranch represented not just financial value but a legacy of sustainable practices that could be passed to future generations. His daughter Maria had used her marketing expertise to help promote the ranch's educational programs, finding fulfillment in supporting work that aligned with her values regarding environmental responsibility. The influence of Samuel's work extended far beyond his own operation. Extension agents throughout the region were adapting his methods to different environments and working with ranchers to implement sustainable grazing systems. Agricultural schools were incorporating his techniques into their curricula, ensuring that future generations of farmers would understand alternatives to industrial agriculture. Most importantly, other ranchers who had once struggled with environmental degradation and economic pressure were finding hope and practical solutions through Samuel's example. Samuel had also become an unlikely advocate for agricultural policy reform, testifying before state and federal committees about the potential for regenerative agriculture to address climate change while maintaining profitable farm operations. His practical experience and measured approach gave credibility to arguments for supporting sustainable agriculture through research funding and technical assistance programs. Politicians who had never heard of rotational grazing were learning to appreciate its potential for addressing multiple challenges simultaneously. The auction house cattle that had been the foundation for Samuel's transformation were now the ancestors of a unique genetic line that attracted attention from breeders around the world. Several of Samuel's bulls were being used in breeding programs designed to introduce hardiness and adaptability into commercial herds. The irony wasn't lost on Samuel that animals purchased for $62 each were now producing offspring worth thousands of dollars while contributing to the improvement of cattle genetics globally. Samuel's daily routine remained much the same as it had been during the early years of his transformation. He was still up before dawn, checking on his cattle and monitoring pasture conditions with the attention to detail that had made his system successful. But now his work was informed by years of proven success and supported by a network of researchers, students, and fellow practitioners who shared his commitment to sustainable agriculture. The ranch was also serving as a model for land restoration projects throughout the region. Areas that had been damaged by overgrazing, erosion, or industrial agriculture were being rehabilitated using techniques developed and refined at the Martinez Ranch. Samuel consulted on these projects when his schedule permitted, but his primary focus remained on continuing to improve his own operation while documenting practices that others could adapt to their own conditions. As Samuel reflected on his journey from failure to recognition, he understood that his greatest achievement wasn't personal success but proof that agriculture could be both profitable and environmentally beneficial. His work demonstrated that careful observation, willingness to learn, and respect for natural systems could produce results that exceeded those achieved through expensive technology and industrial methods. The transformation had required enormous risk, sustained effort, and faith in principles that seemed to contradict conventional wisdom. But Samuel's willingness to trust his own observations and pursue his convictions had created something valuable far beyond personal vindication. He had shown that age could be an advantage rather than a limitation, that experience could be more valuable than capital, and that innovation could come from understanding traditional principles rather than abandoning them. Samuel's story continued to inspire ranchers, farmers, and land managers who faced their own challenges in balancing economic necessity with environmental responsibility. His success proved that sustainable agriculture wasn't just an idealistic concept but a practical approach that could succeed in competitive markets while improving rather than degrading the natural resources on which agriculture depended. The man who had been mocked for his age and dismissed as irrelevant had become a pioneer whose influence would extend far beyond his own lifetime. The ranch that had nearly been lost to debt and drought had been transformed into a legacy that would inspire and educate future generations of agricultural stewards. Samuel Martinez had proven that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the courage to persist when everyone else has given up hope.